This is the annual Best of episode for the year 2020 of the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back and welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania, your host. This is my show, and welcome to our annual Best of episode where we take a look back and share some of our most memorable, popular, and pertinent clips from another year of fascinating conversations with so many absolutely amazing guests. And this is our fifth annual Best of episode, and this is also our way of saying thank you to all of our listeners and our guests for helping to make this show as great as it is. And if recent statistics I've looked at are accurate, we are in the top 3% of podcasts around the world in terms of listenership. So thank you very, very much for that. And when I say best of, that's always in quotation marks because every episode contains a number of wonderful insights, many of which resonated a lot with you and which, of course, we could not include in this episode. Now, if you are new to the show or if you missed a few of our episodes, this one is a great way of not only getting to know a bit more about what the All Things Risk podcast is about, but also of identifying and going back on some of the episodes that you may have missed and you may want to listen to in full. Now, for obvious reasons, 2020 was not a good year for many, and let's face it, 2021, at least based on its first few days, suggests that more challenging times are ahead. However, I would also like to say that this being a show about uncertainty, we've been able to bring together a variety of guests who've been able to share a range of practices, insights, and wisdom that we can use and can serve us very well over the coming months and beyond. So let's get into it. Our first clip comes from my conversation with mental performance coach Mike Clark, and he discusses how even though many of us are taught or believe in the power of visualizing success, there is incredible value in visualizing failure. Here's Mike Clark.
So many people only visualize themselves succeeding and doing the thing perfectly. And I will say that visualization is about programming the brain to feel like we've been there, right? Because at the neurological level, the brain doesn't know the difference between real and imagined when it comes to visualization. And like you're saying, Ben, let's be real about it. Hey, all of your dives aren't going to be perfect. All of your putts aren't going to go exactly where you want them to go. And so it takes a lot of prep up to this point. But I will say, hey, I want you to visualize a specific thing going wrong. I want you to visualize the ball breaking too early or too late on that 9-foot putt, okay? And I want you to walk through then how you're going to respond in that moment. And it's really, really powerful and it's really deep. And here's a double-edged sword. If we do that too often, then what are we training ourselves to see in our mind's eye, right? We're seeing failure.
Right.
Yeah, and so it's a delicate balance.
Did you know that the mind and mental toughness can be trained? Dr. Jason Selk, a sports psychologist who's worked with the likes of the St. Louis Cardinals when they won the World Series and the current NFL Super Bowl champions, the Kansas City Chiefs, as well as a number of business executives, knows a thing or two about that. Here is Dr. Jason Selk giving us a little exercise we can all do to train mental toughness.
Yeah, so I'll just, again, I think probably the most important thing to realize is I've written 4 books, and in each of the 4 books, there's a different version of this mental workout. Okay. So again, I think you'll see conceptually that the important piece is have a game plan and follow the game plan. Don't worry about perfection. But if somebody were to say to me, well, I'm just getting started with this, what would you recommend? There's no doubt, and it's the mental workout I personally use every day is the one that I've outlined in Executive Toughness. So I'll just kind of walk you through that format. First thing you want to do is something called a centering breath. You breathe in for 6 seconds, you hold for 2, you breathe out for 7. And what you're doing there is essentially you're getting air into your diaphragm to make sure that the brain is going to work properly. It's quite normal when a person experiences performance that the body reacts by creating something called performance anxiety, performance stress. It's totally normal. Unfortunately, when the heart rate elevates, which is the first symptom of performance anxiety, it sends a message to the brain that the brain begins to disable itself from detailed thinking. It moves into fight or flight. But what you must understand is your brain starts to disable itself from detailed thought. And that's a really bad thing, right, whether you're in high-level athletics or in business world.
Right.
You need the ability to think clearly with detailed thought. And the centering breath, again, you breathe in for 6, you hold for 2, you breathe out for 7, controls the heart rate so that it doesn't elevate and keeps the brain working properly, right? And then the second step of the mental workout is something called a identity statement. An identity statement is really just kind of a personal mantra that gets you more focused on your strengths than on the normal negative self-talk that most people have. An example of an identity statement, I'll give you mine right now. And again, it just, you create your own with whatever details or whatever's important to you. But the key is you create it so that it forces you to think about your strengths as opposed to some of the other negative stuff that more normally would get in there. My identity statement is, I outwork and outserve the competition every day. I am the most effective performance coach and speaker in the country. I experience true love as a husband and father. Right now, after I repeat my identity statement to myself, then I'm going to do some visualization. We're going to spend about 60 seconds at most in visualization. And we're going to visualize 2 separate categories. The first category, the first 30 seconds of the visualization, I encourage a person to create something called a vision of self-image. And in that vision of self-image, it's a very detailed visual of who and how I want my life to be 5 years from now. And so again, the first part of that personal highlight reel, the first 30 seconds, I just every day watch a video of where I want my life to be 5 years from now. And it's the same video. It might change, I don't know, every year, every couple of years maybe. It's not necessary. You know, sometimes you might have the same vision of self-image for a 5-year period of time. But the important thing to know on this is most people don't have that clear vision of where they're trying to go. And those that do, they often forget about it. But watching that vision, you know, first of all, making sure you have it is important, but watching it every day, reminding yourself, that's why you're getting up and going to try so hard each day so you can end up getting there. It's a really important piece of the puzzle. Okay, so that's the first 30 seconds, what I call the vision of self-image, watching 5 years in the future, who and how you want to be, a very detailed visual. And then I want, right up to that, to take another 30 seconds, focused specifically on the upcoming 24 hours. And I really just think to myself, okay, if 5 years from now, I truly want to have that vision of self-image life that I just watched, what do I need to do? What are a couple of the most important things I need to do in the upcoming day if I'm going to be on track for making that happen? And, you know, again, for me, I'm not only concerned with my professional success, but also my personal success. Things like my own personal health and the relationships with my wife and kids. So in that vision of the upcoming day, I don't just see 2 or 3 important wins at work. I also see things like, am I getting my exercise? Am I spending present time with my wife and kids? Am I hitting my lights out curfew, the time I need to get to bed if I'm going to wake up tomorrow at the right time with the energy to get after it like I need to get after it? So again, the 60 seconds of visualization called the personal highlight reel, the first 30 seconds you take and you focus on where you want to be 5 years from now. And then the second 30 seconds is, okay, let me visualize the success I need to have in the upcoming day if I'm going to position myself for that 5-year success. After I do the visualization, then I just repeat the identity statement again, same identity statement. And then I take another centering breath. Again, breathe in for 6, hold for 2, breathe out for 7. In total, it's 1 minute and 40 seconds worth of mental training.
What do you know about your breath? What about the right way to breathe? Did you know that nasal breathing is much more effective than breathing through our mouths? And did you know that most of us don't breathe properly? And a lot of that affects how we look at the world and the way in which we deal with things going wrong, the way we deal with uncertainty, and a range of other things. If there's somebody on this planet who knows something about the breath, it's Patrick McKeown. He's the author of The Oxygen Advantage and a world-renowned expert on breathwork.
Yeah, the Bolt score, it was first written about back in 1975 by a researcher called Stanley. And it has been written about by several researchers since, Nishino in 2009, Trembach, Messino, etc. in 2017, 2018. It's the length of your comfortable breath hold time after an exhalation. You take a normal breath in and out through your nose. Normal, you shouldn't hear it. So you're sitting down for about 5 minutes, take a normal breath in and out through your nose, and pinch your nose with your fingers. And time, how long in seconds does it take until you feel the first definite desire to breathe, or the first involuntary movement of your breathing muscles. Then let go and breathe in through your nose, and your breath at the end of the Bolt score should be comfortable. Your breath should be normal. Now, it's not a measurement of the maximum breath hold time, because the maximum breath hold time is influenced by willpower and determination. You are stopping breathing at the end of a normal exhalation, and you're timing it in seconds until the brain sends a reaction to breathe. So it's a measurement of dyspnea or breathlessness. If you have an individual with a Bolt score of less than 25 seconds, it's a very strong indicator that they have dysfunctional breathing patterns. Professor Kiesel from, again, one of the universities in the United States, don't know which one, can't remember, he did a study with a group of athletes, and I think it was a decent enough population. I think it was 51 individuals. And he looked at their breathing from many different perspectives. And he concluded that the Bolt score, he didn't call it Bolt score, but it's exactly what we do. He concluded that the breath hold time, if it's above 25 seconds, there is an 89% chance that dysfunctional breathing is not present once you're above 25 seconds. Now, what does it mean to the average individual? Your breath hold time at rest is going to give you some indicator of how you breathe during rest, sleep, and physical exercise. And if you have a low breath hold time during rest, you will have greater disproportionate breathlessness during physical exercise. You're more likely to gas out too soon. You're more likely to have respiratory muscle fatigue because you're having to work your muscles harder. It can lead to muscle fatigue as well, because the harder you breathe, it's also causing blood vessels to constrict and less oxygen gets delivered to the working muscles. And maybe that's something that we do need to talk about, because many people believe that the more air you breathe, the more oxygen that gets delivered throughout the body. That's not the way it happens. But I will talk about that in a second, but the one point that I want to make is individuals with a higher Bolt score, it's a lot easier to sustain nasal breathing. And the group of individuals who tend to have a lower Bolt score, because it is influenced by genetics, anybody with childhood asthma, anybody with, even if they're asthma, if they grew out of their asthma, they still have a tendency towards a lower Bolt score. Anybody with asthma or breathing difficulties, because the Bolt score also is determined, it's influenced by the communication coming from the lungs to the brain. It's not just that it's top down, but it's also bottom up. Individuals with anxiety, 80% of individuals with anxiety and panic disorder are predisposed to dysfunctional breathing patterns. So if there's a genetic predisposition there, and listen, anxiety is going to be prevalent in the athlete population, of course. And it's also prevalent in individuals with perfectionist tendencies, because these same individuals, type A, they're very driven, they set high demands on themselves, and your breathing responds to that because it's a stress on the body. If there's a stress on the mind, the body doesn't know whether, when you're thinking about something, The body is not able to distinguish between a real event that's after taking place or an imagined event. So if you're thinking about something and if you're worrying about something and that imagination is running rife, your body is going to react almost the same way as if that event has taken place.
As if it's a physical threat.
Well, it's like this. If I was to say to you, I'd like you to imagine biting into a lemon, and you're biting into a lemon, you'll start automatically noticing that saliva will change in the mouth. So the body reacts to the mind. And of course, the mind is also going to react to the body. There's bidirectional feedback there. But coming back to it, you will have a lot of athletes in the population, but a lot of individuals, that their breathing patterns are under par. And I suppose typically a guy will say to you, he says, I knew there was something up, but I was training hard, but no matter how I was training, I was never seeming to get across that. I was always plateauing. And the other thing about it is that if you're watching your breathing during the day, during sleep, and if you have decent breathing patterns, it's your everyday breathing that determines how well you breathe during physical exercise. Physical exercise does not change your breathing. It doesn't train your breathing. The only exception to that is swimming. And the reason being is because swimming, you're lying on the pool or the water. The water is pressing against your body. It's adding an extra load onto the breathing muscles. This is helping to improve respiratory muscle strength. But also during swimming, your face is in the water. When your face is in the water, it forces you to breathe less air. When you're forced to breathe less air, your tolerance to carbon dioxide improves. Carbon dioxide is the stimulus to breathe. And if you've got an improved tolerance to CO2, your breathing is naturally lighter during rest and during physical exercise. And the BOLT score is a measure of the chemosensitivity of the body to carbon dioxide. So, people with a low BOLT score, they have a strong chemosensitivity of the body to the buildup of CO2 because it's not oxygen that drives our breathing. The body breathes to breathe out excess carbon dioxide. But the key here is, it's not about breathing out too much carbon dioxide. Oftentimes people will say that oxygen is good and carbon dioxide is bad. They don't seem to realize that in order for oxygen to transfer from the red blood cells, whereby most of the oxygen in the blood is carried by the red blood cells, it's bound by hemoglobin. In order for hemoglobin to release the oxygen, carbon dioxide must be present. So carbon dioxide, increased body temperature, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. But if you're breathing hard, you can lower the carbon dioxide in your lungs by half within about 30 seconds to 1 minute of hard breathing. This in turn will reduce carbon dioxide in the blood. When the carbon dioxide in the blood is reduced, blood vessels constrict and less oxygen gets delivered throughout the body. So if I was to say to any individual, breathe hard for 15 breaths, how do they feel? They feel lightheaded. That's not a sign of superoxygenation. That's a sign of reduced blood flow and reduced oxygen delivery. And the other aspect is here. If anybody is going around hard breathing, they will have a tendency towards cold hands and cold feet and possibly brain fog, because our breathing is influencing our blood circulation. We have 70,000 miles of blood vessels throughout the human body. And if we are in a habit, as I was, of mouth breathing, I always had cold hands. I always had cold feet. I remember as a youngster being in my 20s in universities, and if I was lucky enough to score with some lovely female, she'd be running to the other side of the bed because my feet would be absolutely freezing. And those are the things that you can kind of always remember. So
as you can tell, our first few clips have been about personal resilience, and that continues with this clip from my conversation with Jonny Miller about resilience and dealing with stress, burnout, and grief.
Is finding that healthy eustress, I think Jane McGonigal calls it, and this idea that say astronauts up in the International Space Station, they will lose bone mass density because they're not using their muscles, and to some degree we need to really find what that edge is. And then be able to bring ourselves down. And I think to come back to the resilience framework, the path or the challenge for us is really to find ways to come to those edges of our window of tolerance. So that time where we're often in flow and kind of in that high stress state, and then to drop back down to recover quickly. into a high tone parasympathetic state. And our heart rate variability, which is a great measure or a great proxy measure for resilience, is essentially how quickly can we go from being super stressed out in a good way, to then deep relaxation and deep recovery. And the faster we can do that, often the more resilient our nervous system is.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I love that sort of getting close to the edge, or pushing that envelope and then coming down. And I think that's, when you talk about robustness or anti-fragility, that's the practice that allows us to grow from the stressors. I also like the point that you made about what is the lesson here? What is this situation trying to teach me? Otherwise, you get into repeated behavior, and no changes happen. So
and the where we run into trouble is where our nervous systems get stuck in that state of fight or flight, and we are unable to come back down and to drop into relaxation, and to kind of complete the experience. And for me, I think that I understood this intellectually. I think, like, while I was running the startup tribes, while I was teaching about resilience from an intellectual point of view, but it wasn't until I went through this period of grief after losing my partner, who took her own life 4 years ago, and that experience really it showed me that there were gifts to be had from really getting curious and surrendering into the pain. And I'm profoundly grateful for a lot of the experiences that the grieving process gave me. And that's something I never would have imagined was possible kind of 5 years ago or more.
I think during the grieving process, it's obviously very difficult to realize that. But I think the word that you use that I quite like is the word surrender. And going back to one of the themes of the podcast, this podcast about uncertainty, I think surrendering to uncertainty is a great practice, a great thing that we should be doing, because it is enduring, it's always there. So surrendering to it is the best way to deal with, I think, particularly difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
It's hard to achieve.
I think it's the only way.
Yeah, it's the only way.
I don't think we have a choice. And I think this is more of a Buddhist idea, but the degree to which we resist those things is the degree to which we suffer. And in my personal view, where people struggle the most with grief is where they're resisting the tsunami of energy that grief is. And that resistance comes out through anger, through denial, through depression. Like it's their resisting, like feeling the waves of those grief of grief. And I think learning to surrender to those sensations is where the insights come from. But as you said, it's not easy, and it can take a lifetime.
Perhaps now more than ever, we need to have meaningful, authentic conversations with other human beings. And a great way to do that is by involving and embracing uncertainty in those interactions. That's not always easy to do. Fortunately, Georgie Nightingall has created a business around this very topic. And here she shares a technique that can help us all do that. And it's all about going first.
So another way to get around that, which I feel like is probably one of my most effective tools, is the principle of going first, which means you want to set the scene to have a place where a container that is open-minded, vulnerable, curious, authentic, then you have to do that first. You have to live the principle. And what that will do is people, so in a context where people especially don't know how to behave because it's new to them, let's take events or communities they're not normally part of, or even just virtual, like, Zoom conversations. People don't know how to show up because they don't know the rules, the unwritten rules that are there. So the best way to influence is to show them how people behave in that space. And then people will just follow suit like sheep. It is the most amazing thing. Oldest trick in the book. But, okay, have you ever done that that thing where you're doing a team workshop and everyone's like, we're going to go around, we're going to do introductions, you're going to say, your name. And so if you start and go, hey, I'm Robert, I work as a project manager, and I live in London, then the next person is probably going to say, hey, I'm Sheila, I'm a writer and I live in Newington on Trent. That's interesting. I don't know why I thought about that, but yeah. However, if I say, hey, I'm Georgie and I do a lot of things right now, so I'm not really sure how to define myself, but one of the things that's really got me interested this week is thinking about how we can do better virtual connection and have more meaningful conversations online, because it seems like everyone sort of needs this now. We're quarantined. Suddenly, it's got more interesting.
The next person thinks, oh shit, what am I?
It's really funny because people then change their response based on what the other person said before.
Yes.
It's a classic thing. But it and if I chose in this world to something vulnerable, like I actually know how I'm feeling right now because everything around me is changing, and I mean, even the Zoom call, I'm not really sure how to run it. Suddenly people feel a sense of like empathy and like, yeah, I feel it too, I'm there. And really, let's face it, we all feel, we have the whole spectrum of feelings in us. We aren't perfection itself. We're never perfection. In fact, we're perfectly flawed, I think is the best way to say it. If you can just open up and be vulnerable, be authentic, then other people will do it too, and they'll be the much better version themselves.
That's great, because you're revealing a human side of you, and if this is all about connecting with another human being and other human beings, then we need to do that.
Yeah, completely.
Chris Sparks is one of the top online poker players in the world. And poker, as many of you know, is a game that mimics life because it's all about making decisions under uncertainty. Here, he talks about managing his energy so he is in the optimal position to be able to do so.
Finally is energy. I mean, and this was something that was really kind of a call to Jesus moment for me as I looked at all the other poker players and, they were eating typical pizza and sandwich diets.
Right.
They were staying up till 8 a.m., going out and partying, like really bad posture, not exercising, and then you would see this because, you're playing poker, 12 plus hours, that the pack starts to separate once you get to that 8 to 12 hour mark, where the guys who have poor energetic habits, they tend to make poor decisions and they chalk it up to getting unlucky, but it's that they just didn't have it anymore, right? They ran out of gas. And so I looked at, there was a point in time early in my poker career, I was eating a whole pizza and drinking a 2 liter of pop and going, that's soda for those of you guys in the UK.
Fizzy drinks. Yeah.
Going to bed whenever I felt like it. And I realized, wow, like I need to, if I want to perform like a cognitive athlete, I need to treat myself as a physical athlete. And so that having a consistent schedule where I'm waking up and doing the things that put myself in the best possibility to succeed, getting a great night's sleep, exercising every day, eating the right things that make me feel good. All of these things, these little things really add up to being able to perform. And so, I was fortunate in that I had a large financial incentive where if I did not do these things, it was very obvious on the bottom line. And through that process was able to identify some things that generalized to knowledge workers, to investors, that they put these same things into place in their own lives. They perform better, they make better decisions, and it shows up on the bottom line.
I love that. Particularly around that, likening it to, you're a cognitive athlete, right? And I think people that are listening to this, many of them are in knowledge work or intellectual work. And I keep saying to most of the people either on this podcast or people I speak to that we often, in the work that we do in knowledge work, that we sometimes separate the sort of mind-body connection, but we shouldn't. And we should integrate those two things because if you, as you say, sleep right, you eat right, you're going to perform better. And it sounds obvious, but you just walk around many offices around the world and these things are treated as entirely separate things. And I love how you talk about getting an edge through better discipline of in terms of treating yourself like an athlete?
It's so much comes down to, cultivating a sensitivity and awareness. The more sample size we have, we can identify the patterns. And so you talked about a mind-body connection. When I'm playing a hand, sometimes, I'll notice I'm sitting a certain way. I've leaned in versus I've leaned back, or I have a twinge in my neck, or I start to get, sore in a certain area. And like all of these things are sources of information that we can try to calibrate over time. But it requires cultivating this awareness in the first place.
Right.
And I think that's a big part. We've talked about feedback loops a little bit. I think a big part of why feedback loops are so critical to improvement is that we become aware of where things stand, and thus our attention is drawn to, right? I call this a forcing function. We draw our consciousness to ways that we can improve this number. But without this awareness, right, without taking a hard look at things, we aren't aware of opportunities to improve because we aren't aware that we need to improve in the first place.
Mm-hmm. When you were trying to optimize your performance as a poker player, where did you look for some of these insights that your competitors weren't looking? Because all of this stuff is available to people. It comes from psychology, comes from all types of other sources. But where did you go for this type of edge?
I've made it a habit to look at peak performers in tangential fields and try to identify things that they're doing that might be worth trying. I think it's as an investor, you're looking at things that can work in one market and can be imported to another market. So I was looking at, professional video gamers. I was looking at chess grandmasters. I think there's a lot of literature from the military that's very useful. Where else? Believe it or not, I think a lot of decision making is, process orientation. So some of the kind of manufacturing theory of constraints work is very useful. Chefs, I think if you look at Michelin star level chefs, they're more process oriented than just about anyone. I've taken a lot from there. Really, it's just looking at everyone as a potential expert. Some areas, even now, I don't consider myself to be super knowledgeable, but I'm fortunate enough to have someone in my network who specializes there. So I'm not shy about asking them questions or even bringing them on as a partner when necessary.
And speaking of poker, Alec Torelli is another poker player we have had on the show. Here, he talks about decision making.
So the first part of that is just to focus on the expectation. So a classic example is you hear someone say something like, okay, we know smoking is a bad decision. But you'll hear someone try to refute that by saying, well, my grandma smoked, she lived to 95. But, the EV or the expected value of that person's decision to smoke, let's say on average nets them negative 10 years of life, depending on when they started, how often they smoke, and all those things. So the key is just to focus on that process of like, what is the value long term of the decision that I am going to make or that I have made? And so I think framing it in that way helps separate the results, and it also helps remove biases to just focus on what's important. And the other part of that that's really hard is that it's just hard to hypothetically know what would have happened in an alternative reality or like a parallel universe if you can simulate a complete different decision in another vacuum. So for example, I often think, was dropping out of school to play poker the right decision? And like I actually quote made it. Like I reached my goals. I played at the highest levels. I succeeded in poker, but I still question that decision because I wonder what was my EV if I had stayed in school and got a degree? What was my EV if I tried to start a company instead and worked on a big, potentially impactful project? And so I actually think about those sorts of things, and I think okay, let me try to assign a probability to my success in that endeavor as best as I could at the time. Again, knowing the information you have, right? Like after the hand, when you can see your opponent's cards, it's easy to say, I should have folded, I should have called. But at the time when I was 18, I only had the skills and the information that I had. So I had to make that decision at that time with that information. And it's important to, when you're, reflecting on things in the past, to analyze it under that construct. So I think just the act of trying to do this is a step in the right direction. And I think most people probably don't. And I think that's a good thing to even do, just to be asking yourself the questions, but also being understanding that at least when reflecting in the past, you'll never know what the other outcome will be. Like I might have started, in a parallel universe, I might have started an incredible company that changed the world, or I might have been a complete failure and like dropped out of college to do that and just failed miserably. And poker was a way better choice in 97% of the simulations. I just don't know. So I think going back, it's important to just kind of be at peace with some of the decisions you made while trying to always improve in the future. And then going forward, just at doing your best to try and assign probabilities to the decisions you make and assign values to them, and just look at the expectations of various outcomes to the best of your ability and bet on the outcomes that have the highest expectations.
Christian Hunt heads up Human Risk, a consultancy all about human behavior as a risk, and a podcast of the same name. We had our very first crosscast, and I love this particular clip in which Christian talks about the importance of not planning too much.
I think the first off is if you overplan your life, and I mean literally in the long term and the short term, you are missing opportunities for serendipity, for randomness, for comedy.
Absolutely.
And it also suggests that there's a level of certainty, a level of control. That somehow if I write it down in a plan, it will become the way the world is. And if we all think about our careers, and you and I have had a discussion about this before, careers don't come from certainly our careers didn't come from planning. We'll pretend afterwards they did, and we'll create a story, but they didn't. It was totally, I met this person, then this happened, and that happened. And we feel the need to weave a story to sort of create a sense of logic. But actually the truth of the matter is it was just a bunch of random stuff that we took advantage of. And so we wouldn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation if both of us hadn't kind of just gone for it in certain ways and kind of taken risks and not planned too much, or thrown the plan that we had out of the window. And so I really like that as an idea. And I think, I've had some of my best evenings out and holidays where I've kind of gone, let's go for it. Now, you can take it too far. I don't honestly recommend getting on a plane and going, we'll work out where we stay when we get there. That's gone hideously wrong for me. It's also gone hideously right for me. And I think in a world where there's a sort of fear of missing out, it's kind of cool to just go, I've got some spare capacity for randomness and strange things to happen. And that might be awful strange things. It might be amazing strange things. But I think if you don't allow the script to write itself a little bit, you are literally going, I have plan A. And if plan A doesn't work out, I don't know, because I've got plan A. And you keep coming. And I think in this uncertain world, and in a world where stuff doesn't work in a linear fashion, and there's lots of random elements, and we try and make sense of it. And we talk about, bad luck comes in threes, and we look for patterns, and the whole load of shit goes down in the world. And so I think allowing a little bit of capacity in our lives for that, recognizing that if we lived our whole lives that way, right, we would not be fed. We'd probably be, we wouldn't have relationships, we wouldn't have jobs. It's not smart to, but I like that idea because I think there's a natural tendency to want to control stuff, and letting go. And it's the same as doing stuff that somebody else says, do you want to come to this? And I there's a limit to this, but generally speaking, unless I've got a really good reason for saying no, I'll say yes.
Sometimes giving up, in quotes, might be the right thing to do. Here is Sarah Kamalo, who was the first Black African to have summited Mount Everest, talking about the importance of knowing when to turn back.
So it's looking at where I am, what's happening around me, and continue moving cautiously. Because sometimes pulling back, not necessarily giving back, giving up, but it's saying it's not the right time. I want to be able to come and climb another day. There is something called summit fever, on Everest especially, where people say, I've paid so much money, I'm here and I can see the summit, and not realizing that once I get there, then I don't have enough oxygen to come back. So what was the point? You're not going to come back and tell the story, and I'm very much, I make decisions that way, but you also can bring in the team dynamics. So I'm there and there's somebody else. If I go further, will they be okay or will they not? If I assess and I think they will not, I'll come back, because that's a life and it's more important than a picture on the summit. I think life always wins.
I love that analogy of summit fever. I think that's very appropriate. And the way you describe, can I live to climb another day? Because sometimes I think people feel a bit of a sense of defeat or shame when they quit or you fail at something, and it's just part of the journey. So it's okay. And sometimes you have to turn around and say, look, I could do this, but it would the price would be too high, and if you go back, and it's about circling back and trying again. I think that's a very healthy way of approaching things.
I call it failing forward. Mm-hmm. It's only a fail to learn from it. Learn from it, and you use those learnings for the next climb. That was a stepping stone that you needed to actually be able to succeed. You said something that you figured something. So it's Women's Month in South Africa. August is Women's Month. And one of the most interesting things is the 3 times that I wasn't able to make the summit. It was okay for me to say, I didn't make it, and people to feel sorry. Next time, maybe it's not for you. Then when I summited, happy, but you can't celebrate too much. I'm like, no. So now I'm joining this campaign where it says I'm not about my success. I worked hard. I'm going to be on the challenges, but I'm also going to own the successes. And that's the way to do it, because many times females feel like I need to be humble about it. No, I don't need what the success was a celebration, and I've celebrated forever because I worked hard.
How do you make a seemingly impossible decision? Dr. Richard Harris was the cave diver and anesthesiologist who played a pivotal role in the rescue of the Wild Boars football team from the Tham Luang cave in Thailand in 2018. It was a feel-good story, but at the time it didn't really look like it. Here is Dr. Richard Harris.
Well, I started to think it through, realizing that might be asked of me, but I still maintained that it was the most dangerous and impossible solution to this problem. And I really held that view until the last boy came out, to be honest. I did not believe it could work until all those boys were out and alive. And I still look back and I'm slightly incredulous how it did work, to be honest.
Can you first talk us through the ins and outs of, sedating children in a cave and why you thought this was never going to work? What led you to your initial reaction?
Well, I mean, whilst I have worked in austere environments, landing in helicopters at road accidents and so forth, and I'm not working in those sort of environments is not strange to me. Anaesthetising children is always slightly more precarious in some ways than anaesthetising adults. The margin for error in kids tends to be slightly smaller. They respond more rapidly, they deteriorate more rapidly, but on the positive, they get better more rapidly. And you're just slightly more alert and on your game when you're looking after kids. So, the thought of anaesthetising kids always makes me a bit more vigilant, but to do it in the back of a cave, in the dark, half in water, half in mud, I thought, well, that's a challenge in itself. But to be honest, that wasn't the part that worried me. What worried me was how can you possibly keep a child alive, immersed and anaesthetised? So the 3 immediate problems that were obvious to me was firstly how to protect their airway. And we've done a lot of training with full face masks. So obviously a normal scuba diver will wear a half mask, which covers their eyes and their nose, and they'll have a regulator, a mouthpiece in their mouth. But if you put a full face mask on them, it seals all the way around their forehead and round under their chin. So they can just breathe in and out through their nose or their mouth into a space in front of them. And that's fine in theory, but inevitably these sort of masks get a bit of water in them. And if you're unconscious, you only need half a cup of water in there to drown. And I thought that surely over the course of 3 hours that some water will get in there, or even just their own secretions will drown them. As a diver, you're an active participant in maintaining your airway and keeping your mask clear, and so I felt that it was inevitable that would be a problem. The second thing is that, all first aiders are taught that in an unconscious person, as soon as their head falls forward or, their tongue falls back, their airway can obstruct. And so in the operating theatre or at the roadside, we are very vigilant to keep people's airways open if they're unconscious or anaesthetised. Well, of course, in zero visibility water, and knowing that I couldn't myself look after each of these boys for their 3-hour journey all the way out, we'd only rescue 1 or 2 boys a day if we did that, I'd be handing over these kids' care to some non-medical people. How could they possibly maintain these kids' airways for 3 hours when they couldn't even see them, let alone be familiar with those techniques? So if they didn't drown, I felt sure their airways would obstruct at some point. And finally, when you anaesthetise someone, their temperature usually starts to fall quite quickly unless you take active measures to prevent that. And so again, I just thought, in this 23-degree water, which the kids would be in, their core temperature will surely be headed south towards 23 degrees pretty rapidly. And if those other things don't kill them, by the end of 3 hours, they'll have died of hypothermia. So really, I could see no possible conceivable way that these children could survive that journey. And of course, the other guys in the team who weren't medical couldn't perhaps really comprehend or see all the problems that I could see. And, to them it was, not so clear that it was an impossible thing to do. But armed with all the knowledge that I had, I just couldn't see that it could work. Maybe it's a case of a little knowledge is safe rather than dangerous in this case. So what amount of input did you have into the decision-making process? Because if they went with that decision, then clearly all of the other options were just terrible options. Yeah, well, ultimately it was my decision whether I would participate, and I could say no at any stage, and without me then it wouldn't have gone ahead, I guess, because I was the guy at the sharp end who was going to administer the anaesthetic and teach the other divers how to maintain the anaesthetic and look after the children in that state. So I had to be convinced, and there was a little bit of pressure from the rest of the team to pursue this idea, but really I had to take the time to come to that decision myself, and that meant having about 24 hours on the ground, diving through the cave myself to see what the conditions were like and to see the boys, which was really important to me. Get a sense of how robust they were and what sort of mental state they were in. I didn't want to drag some kicking and screaming children to the water and then, basically assault them and inject them. And, I couldn't have dealt with that. So, and the other thing was just to look at all the other plans that were in place, the water pumping efforts, the water diversion, the idea that perhaps we could even teach the kids to dive and bring them out through the cave, whether we could support them through the monsoon season in situ and just look after them on the bit of mud that they were sitting and feed them and, look after them and that. And so one by one I examined all these plans, and one by one I realised that they were all completely hopeless. And, the monsoon rains had eased off significantly whilst over the last few days, so the water levels in the cave were static. They weren't falling, but they certainly weren't rising at that point. But the forecast was for 3 or 4 more days, and then the monsoons proper would arrive, and the cave would turn back into the maelstrom that Rick and John and Ben had witnessed early on. And once that happened, no one could even enter the cave, let alone, regularly visit and supply the kids. So they would surely die a very unpleasant, slow death from exposure and starvation or infection. So I knew we couldn't do that. The water pumping and so forth would be quickly overwhelmed by the monsoons. And once I'd actually seen the cave and done the dive, I realised that any idea of teaching the kids to dive was impossible. I mean, it was a significant cave dive, and you can't expect a novice to do that without panicking in zero vis being pushed through restrictions and so forth. So it really left this anesthesia option, and basically, was I prepared to do it? And I think at the end of the day, I decided to proceed based on this very binary decision that whilst I thought that these children wouldn't survive what we were proposing, the alternative actually seemed worse, to leave them to die this very slow death rather than have them die under an anaesthetic, which at least from their perspective would be a death that they wouldn't know anything about. Wow. So it's a pretty gruesome choice, but that's what it came down to. So I thought, well, to do anything for these children might be kind of falling on my own sword and probably lose my career and my morality even, but at least these children won't suffer for 3 or 4 weeks until they perished. So that's kind of the attitude I went into it with.
Speaking of decisions, when should you go with your gut? Well, according to Gleb Tsipursky, never, or just about never. Here he is talking about where a gut instinct comes from and why it is so dangerous to trust it.
Gut feel is just something that you feel intuitively is the right thing. It's very simple, it's very clear, and it's very unfortunate. When you talk about authenticity, you talk about all of these ideas. I don't even think the problem is not when it's taken to the extreme. The problem is when the concept is perceived to be correct and appropriate, because it does things to our mind when we think we should be authentic, except, not go to the extreme. That's not the right way to think about it. Authenticity is very often a problem for us, as human beings, because authentically we belong in the savanna environment, in the hunter and forager environment. That's where our authenticity, our gut reactions, our feelings, our instincts, our intuitions, which, they're all the same thing. When people say this, be authentic, be primal. I mean, Tony Robbins has his idea, be primal, and so on. Or these are all the same things. They amount to the same thing. They amount to, if we feel something is right, then it's right. If we feel we love someone, then it's true love. Mm-hmm. If we feel this is the right business decision, then it's the right business decision. If we feel like this is the right person to vote for, then it's the right person to vote for. If we feel that, this is a good business relationship, if we feel that this is a person who would make a good business partner, then this person would make a good business partner. We confuse our feelings for what is true. We confuse information that we like for what is right. Mm-hmm. And that all goes back to where our gut intuitions come from. They come from the savanna environment, from the tribal savanna environment. That is what they evolved for when we as human beings were hunters and gatherers, were foragers. That's what they evolved for living in small tribes of 15 to maximum 150 people. So kind of small tribes of people who all looked like each other and who thought pretty similarly. So that's kind of one aspect of what's going on with our gut intuitions is tribalism. There are two critical aspects of tribalism. We like people who look like us, who think like us, who feel like us, who have our beliefs, who have our, everything that seems similar to us. That's one critical aspect of tribalism. The other critical aspect of tribalism, which we saw in the Bernie Ebbers and WorldCom and Tycho cases, Enron, is that we want to climb to the top of the social hierarchy, and we don't want to climb down. And that causes us to feel really bad when we perceive ourselves as going down in the social hierarchy. So that's tribalism, and that explains a lot of what causes us to make very, very, very bad decisions. So that's one aspect of things. Now, the second aspect of things that that it's very important for us to understand about our feelings is the fight or flight response. You might have also heard about it as the saber-toothed tiger response or the lizard brain. It's the thing that causes us to overreact greatly to threats, perceived threats. Now, in the savanna environment, that was really important. That was really good because it was better for us to jump at 100 shadows than miss one saber-toothed tiger. However, in the current environment, we have many, 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 many less saber-toothed tigers around us. We're much less likely to die because of saber-toothed tiger, but we greatly overreact to perceived threats around us. And that causes not only a great deal of stress, but it causes us to make very quick, very poor decisions because they're made very quickly and intuitively. So the tribalism was critical for the survival of our ancestors. We are the descendants of those people who were strongly tribal, who liked others like themselves and who climbed the social hierarchy. We are also the descendants of people who jumped at 100 shadows, so had that strong fight or flight response. So our gut feelings are nothing but those evolutionary impulses. The tribal impulse and the fight or flight impulse. And that explains a great deal of what is wrong with our societies right now when we have the feeling that something is right and true, which again comes from our savage, natural, primitive background, and we react based on it as though it's the right thing to do, as opposed to doing the civilized thing. Just like, we can eat with our hands and just like follow the natural state, or we can use a fork and knife. We've learned how to use a fork and knife. Unfortunately, we haven't learned how to avoid going with our gut and being primal. And that's a horrible aspect about our current society and our businesses.
All right, up next is a clip from one of our most popular episodes of the past year. Stephen Hassan is the world's foremost expert on cults, mind control, and undue influence. And here he challenges some common misperceptions about those that get involved in these crazy things.
The phobias don't make sense, right? They're irrational, but
right. But you're explicating the key point, which is using your frontal cortex to analyze data and to say what is the percentage of risk in this thing. It's far more dangerous to get in a shower than it is to whatever cult group it is. In my case, I was out of the cult for 4 years when I learned about phobias in one of my classes, and I thought back to you were asking me about my memories of the cult experience. There was a lot that I had never unpacked, and that was part of my healing journey. And I remembered, where was it that I had the phobia so installed that I stopped any critical thinking? And it was when Moon had brought a group of us to see the Exorcist movie, because it had come out. We watched it. Then we all got in vans, went up to Tarrytown, and Moon gave a lecture about how God made this movie, and this is what would happen to you if you leave the church. So as a Jewish person, I didn't believe in Satan or evil spirits a few weeks earlier, but the potency of the controlled environment and the indoctrination and this creation of the pseudo-self came to accept that all these evil spirits are constantly around me, trying to invade me, trying to take me away from my mission with God to save the planet. And I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night, and I wasn't thinking analytically or critically at all.
And they do that specifically so those faculties are diminished, don't they?
100%. And one of my teachers, someone who had studied Chinese communist brainwashing in the 50s, Margaret Singer, as well as Robert J. Lifton and Edgar Schein. But Margaret Singer said it's impossible to do mind control on an informed person. If you know what's being done to you, you'll never agree to it. You would never allow the beliefs to be accepted as real.
What's interesting, going back to when those 3 women approached you, is that whenever you hear stories of so-and-so was in a cult, or so-and-so got involved in this, this crazy church, or it could be a pyramid scheme or a multi-level marketing scam or one of these types of things, and you think, I thought that guy was smart. I thought that somebody wouldn't be so gullible. But I think what your experience highlights is that we can all have these sort of moments of weakness, and they can be exploited. So it's not a question simply of cognitive abilities or intelligence or whatever. That it's typically you can look at people who run scams. They go after people that are in vulnerable positions or desperate for financial health or or actual health. Why do people buy into cancer cures by whatever supplement or whatever?
Right.
These are all.
So everybody's human, and everybody goes through, situational vulnerabilities, whether it's the death of a loved one, whether it's an illness, whether it's, graduating and moving to a new city, state, or country, or breaking up in a relationship. I mean, I don't know anyone who's had a perfect life where there's been no trauma, no disruption. But the key thing is being educated about how mind control cults operate.
Yes.
That's the key thing. Like, I remember being told when credit cards were invented, you never give your credit card number to a stranger over the phone, no matter what story they give you. No matter how persuasive it is, you never give your credit card number to a stranger. You need to have that kind of awareness that there are scam artists who are far slicker than you can possibly be, but having certain guidelines, like checking things out independently before you give your name and phone number or details to a stranger. But I want to also say that I was reading postgraduate level when I was 8 years old. I skipped 8th grade. I was considered to be an extra honor student, and so and many of my friends who are ex-members are valedictorians, firsts in their classes, just brilliant people. But no one ever told them, hey, you're not invulnerable. And at the right time, with the right person, with an approach that resonates with what you're interested in, can happen to anybody. And so I'm very happy to do this podcast with you, because I want your listeners to get off the chair of I'm too smart, it could never happen to me, and say, you know what? Cults want really smart people. They don't want dumbbells. They want people who are educated. They want people who are effective, successful, creative, because you're going to bring in more money, you're going to recruit more people for them. They don't want people who are losers or people with emotional problems.
Speaking of cults, could a multi-level marketing scheme or a pyramid scheme be considered a cult? Absolutely it could. This is a clip from my conversation with Robert Fitzpatrick, who is the world's leading expert on multi-level marketing schemes and also the author of the new book, Ponzi-nomics. And multi-level marketing involves a very interesting assumption that just does not hold. And that assumption is all about risk. Here's Robert Fitzpatrick.
Is there, we're talking about a model, unsustainable model, endless chain model. You're doomed by design, but it is cast as a business. So it is actually presented to you as an escape from risk. In other words, the rest of life is all risk.
The certainty narrative is very attractive, right?
Yes. So it's presented to you as the perfect plan, and it is called, the first MLM, they called, the company was called Neutralite, but that was about an innocuous vitamin pill. When you got into the business, they showed you, quote, the plan. That's all they called it. When Amway took over Neutralite, they did exactly the same thing. You would go to a meeting and you'd hear about the plan, right? And the plan was this airtight, perfect scheme. 5 get 25, 2 get 4, get 8, get 16, and there you are reaping the benefits coming in the door. Risk, which you've been in your whole life and not doing that well, getting your ass beat, in business and sales and school teaching and working as a post office, as a fireman, or whatever it is, you're losing. This is where you become a winner. So it's arguing that, now, in a market economy, which, as we know, is all about risk, reward, failure, success, those are kind of the way market economies are defined. We don't we don't, we truthfully, in a market economy, you don't think about sublime fulfillments. You don't think about, really, we don't have much word for that. We don't have great language for other ways to fulfill your life. I mean, we talk about it a little, but really, if you didn't make any money, you're a loser. I mean, I heard Donald Trump refer to a reporter as, you're a lightweight. You don't talk to me like that. You're a lightweight. So no matter, somebody could be a brilliant genius and so on, but if they drive up in an old Honda, we don't really respect them. I mean, that's kind of true. So you take that
collectively, that's the world in which we live, right? That we're always being sold new stuff. We've got to keep the economy going. Got to keep buying stuff.
Yeah, we're already prone to believe this anyway, So as I say, multi-level marketing didn't have to invent new language. It just borrowed the language and the myths we already have, and then grossly exaggerated and distorted them. Now this is now spread. It spreads. I said it's like the ships with products going all over the world. They had rats in them in the hull. Well, the rats went wherever the products went. Right, so, the diseases went with the sailors. Multi-level marketing rides with capitalism. So wherever capitalism goes, multi-level marketing goes, and it goes as a manifestation of capitalism, the highest manifestation. So you've got people in China who their first introduction to capitalism turned out to be working in sweatshops, right, making plastic junk and electronic products. But real capitalism is compound interest. It's Las Vegas, it's Disney World, right? It's Wall Street. It's Madison Avenue. That's real capitalism. That's the one people long for, and that's exactly what multi-level marketing claims to be. It's capitalism claims to be. Well, how do you know it is? Look, there's products, people buying and selling. Some of these companies even traded on New York Stock Exchange. Must be capitalism. Has to be. So, okay, capitalism, that's what we want. That's going to deliver us. And then it's capitalism, not just a job. It's you're an owner, a business owner. In an Amway and all these others, you're called an IBO, an independent business owner. Imagine you're a little, a farmer in a little village somewhere in Thailand. You suddenly become an independent business owner with a multinational company. You can see it has such gigantic appeal wherever it goes. It is selling capital. And let's face it, right now there isn't any competing. There's no competition to that capitalistic story. There's no communism out there. Socialism is not really much of a story. There isn't much out there, as I said, offering fulfillment, happiness, prosperity, only capitalism right now. And if Amway is allowed to present itself as the highest form of capitalism, then of course it's going to go everywhere. Now, we should add in, just as we told the story of how the reality, the truth of it, has become more, more people are aware, and it's become more widely known now in the U.S. This will happen and is already happening in other countries. So, I'm getting complaints and inquiries from all over the world here, from Egypt, from South Africa, from Lithuania, everywhere. The same story. Hey, I joined Herbalife or this or that. I think this thing might be a scam, but what do you know? You're in America. Is it a scam? So just as there is a political side here, you have, and here we have a 44-member caucus in Congress, in the House of Representatives, 44 members, called the Direct Selling Caucus. And they have been organized and funded by the multi-level marketing industry to protect it from law enforcement, investigation, and so on. This same thing goes on every country. There's an element of influence buying that occurs everywhere.
True innovation and creativity involves embracing uncertainty. the exact opposite of what an MLM might preach. Here is Frans Johansson, who is the author of The Medici Effect and The Click Moment, talking about the role of luck and serendipity in our personal lives, business, and beyond.
Yeah, so many of the ideas that I've been talking about here so far in this podcast is really a mix between the Medici Effect and the Click Moment. Mm-hmm. I could essentially say this. In the Medici Effect, I really studied and looked for this idea that diversity drives innovation, that by combining ideas from different fields and cultures, you have a better shot at coming up with something groundbreaking. But there was one area that I talked about, but didn't really explore more deeply, which was that these idea combinations tend to be effectively random, right? You can't really go in and predict ahead of time exactly which combinations are going to make the most difference. So my second book, The Click Moment, really used that as a platform to leap into the world of the unexpected, the world of uncertainty, of serendipity, of randomness. And it makes a pretty radical claim, which is that most success in companies and in careers in life are effectively serendipitous or random. It doesn't appear that way because we as humans are exceptional at piecing together a narrative post facto, after the fact. But when we step into it, but when we look ahead, it's not going to play out the way we thought. And to me, it challenges this notion of planning. It challenges the notion of analysis. It challenges all these notions, but simply saying that increasingly the world is becoming more uncertain, more unexpected. So now this fact that success is driven by that is becoming increasingly true. So the book first establishes that indeed is the case. I basically deconstruct many of the success stories that we've seen today, and I trace them back to more unexpected serendipitous moments. And then I look at what can we do about it? What does that imply for us? How do we think about then capturing the unexpected when it happens?
Right. There's no formula for absolute success, is there?
I don't believe there is. Mm-hmm. I believe that there is formula for higher than average success.
Right.
Okay. Work hard tends to get you. You can work hard.
Increases the likelihood. Yep.
You develop a skill set somewhere. Okay. That tends to also work. Have a social network and grow that. If you do those three things, then you're improving the shot of success a bit above average, but that's about as well as we can do. Right. I mean, the rest of it comes from the other actions that we take, and that means that we have to invite effectively variability. We have to invite difference into our lives, and then we have to pounce on it when we feel that something has happened that works for us, that works in our favor.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. And I think this is where a lot of organizations and individuals kind of get things confused or wrong. There's a thing called the survivorship bias. Not sure.
Yes.
Which is, so-and-so made it, so I have to be exactly like that person. Yeah. Whether it's, we mentioned Richard Branson. So, you're not going to become Richard Branson by going back and just repeating, because you didn't start out as Richard Branson. So you won't be, but
no, and
eating his breakfast every day isn't going to get you, isn't going to do the thing for you or whatever it is.
That's right. And actually in the Click Moment, I explore a number of different stories like that. One interesting case study that I was kind of exploring in the book was Sony, that went up against and they had in the 70s and early 80s they had there was a VHS war. That was the VHS videotapes was how everybody was watching movies and recording movies at the time. But it was actually another system as well, which was Betamax, which was Sony's system. So it was VHS versus Betamax in a warfare, and VHS won out. And in part they won out, actually, not just in part. The dominating factor why they won out was because Sony did not allow adult movies to be on Betamax, but they just did. And so now the video rental starts crushing network effects. No video store really wants to carry two formats. They want to carry one. Yeah. So the second it starts feeling like one format is going to win over, it sort of just tends to accelerate the winner. So here's VHS. Okay, great. Now, Sony goes into another format war in the 2000s. And this was Blu-ray versus HD. This was called then. And HD was, I believe, Panasonic's. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was Panasonic's. And Blu-ray was Sony's. And again, Sony said, you know what? No Blu-ray for adult movies. And people like you would see it in Wall Street Journal and Business Insider, Business Week, Fortune. Wow, they're making the same mistake again. Well, the result was probably going to be the same. Of course, it wasn't. Blu-ray won out. Because the world had changed. We're not playing the same game. The world today, and these are big implications for Sony in both cases. But it doesn't make sense to say I'm just going to copy what I did last time to reach success, or what somebody else did, because nothing is the same. You're not the same. The world's not the same. The customers, clients, employees, partners, whatever. None of that is the same. It has changed. So you're actually, even when you think that you're repeating it, you're actually not really repeating it. We can't dip into the same river twice.
Let's talk unintended consequences. Here is Paul Orlando.
I think some of the incentives for an organization to do that are, they're just not there. Like the incentive is actually to not think about certain things, because that prevents the project from getting funded. Right. That slows everything down. That lets you, be outcompeted by a competitor. So there's actually a lot of just like, whether it is intuitive or whether it's like, thought out, there's a lot of reasons to not think about these things. And if something goes wrong, what is the worst that happens? You don't get the bonus at the end of the year.
Right. It's society's left holding the bag, and the regulators and everything else. It's exactly like the financial crisis, where these financial weapons of mass destruction were created, and the gains were privatized, but the losses were socialized.
Exactly. And related to startups, maybe just like the last point. So a discussion that I've been having for a while with people is related to autonomous vehicles, and the storytelling is that why on earth would you choose to maintain this high level of fatalities caused by automobile accidents, right? Humans aren't perfect. They make mistakes. They drive drunk. They drive tired. In the U.S., which is a pretty safe country related to automotive accidents, it's about 3,000 fatalities a month. It's a lot higher in other parts of the world, actually, unfortunately. And so, why on earth would you want to argue for that continuance, and instead turn over driving to a computer that's going to do this much better, that's not going to be tired, not going to make mistakes, going to learn as it goes along? And that is the story that has led to hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in various companies related to autonomous driving. And the reason that I pause here, and this kind of relates to the whole startup, or how do who eats the risk of something like this, is I think of it as, when you have human drivers, they're not perfect, but human beings are kind of comfortable with that type of a risk, as in, I kind of understand, when I get in the car, in general, it's pretty safe, but there is this tiny risk. I need to remember to be vigilant, or I just need to build that into the way that I go about my day. And maybe if the autonomous cars work as well as they potentially do, maybe you reduce those fatalities monthly to from 3,000 to maybe it's 30. It's significant. Once in a while, though, do you get that 30 to then spike up because there's a bug that propagates an entire fleet? Right. Or there is a group that hacks into again, a fleet or geography and causes just mayhem. So I wonder, since you cannot actually convince human beings to be less safe as drivers, that's something that's it's contrary to their personal interest, because it puts that at physical risk. You can't convince people to drive, and kill themselves. You can do that top down with an AV system, at least, in theory. And, we have many examples of different systems being hacked or bugs propagating. So that's one, again, where I pause a little bit and I say, okay, if this is mainstream and it's like level 4, level 5 levels of autonomy in driving, do you make things safer for like a little while? It's like an efficiency or an optimization question. But also, every once in a while, you have this huge spike and it's chaos and an entire city is shut down, right? And that's one of the things that led to me being just a little bearish about autonomous driving. And maybe we should rethink how we would deploy this in an environment, and like there's been a number of ideas about that. But like that's, again, it's a question where I don't really see a lot of people taking the other side and saying, okay, well, we have this efficiency that comes in, but what happens if it breaks down? And the way things operate today, it's human drivers individually driving. I cannot make a million of them do the wrong thing today if I want. They all have that self-interest, and they're all like individuals. So, but I could do that with a fleet of autonomous vehicles, or either intentionally or unintentionally. So, there again, like that's a startup story that has been told a number of times. It's about safety, who likes the drudgery of driving, right? And again, it's something that just makes me wonder about the risks.
Popular culture is powerful and often neglected when it comes to changing perceptions about some of the biggest and most important risks and uncertainties and issues of our time. Here is Dr. Todd Boyd, aka the Notorious PhD, and by the way, probably the most stylish guest we've had on the show, talking about the role of popular culture and the perceptions of race in the United States.
So if you look at something like in 1988, MTV began airing Yo MTV Raps. Anybody who had cable anywhere in the U.S. could watch MTV. MTV, of course, had prior to this time not featured black artists on their channel. There was controversy. Michael Jackson would become, groundbreaking in this space. A small handful of others, but black artists weren't really being played. Yo MTV Raps changed that. So it's not as though Yo MTV Raps gave hip hop credibility, but what it did do is give hip hop a platform that was bigger than the one it had already. So I think, for multiple generations now, we have white people who have grown up in America with black music and by extension, black culture at the center of the conversation. This was not the case when I was born. It was not the case as I was growing up, but it became the case during the 1990s. Hip hop culture, black culture in general, you talk about sports, you talk about music, you talk about film and television, fashion, art. America would be a really, really different place if not for the cultural influence of African Americans. It would be boring and tasteless and lacking in flavor. And I say that jokingly, but I'm also serious because America, which likes to advertise itself as a nation of immigrants, has people from all over the world, but there are two groups of people in America who are not immigrants. Native Americans, whose land it was, and black people who were brought here as slaves. So to talk about American culture, at one time you were really talking about Irish culture or Italian culture, perhaps Catholic culture. It's the Black American that helps to define Black music, American music, subsequently American culture. I like to say that, as a descendant of both African Americans and Native Americans, I am a representative of the most American one can be. So if you trace your family's history back to Europe, miss me with all this patriotism and judgment and, boasting about like your country, because I don't see it that way, and my ancestors didn't see it that way. So, to talk about what is America, right? And to talk about American culture, it's Black culture in many cases. So we have multiple generations of people who have come of age now who understand that. White people I'm speaking of, who grew up listening to Black music, and through that music they were exposed to things that were not in their normal everyday environment. And, as I say, this has been going on, for a while now. So I can see a direct connection between those sentiments and, more recent protests where people have been schooled in some ways in what it means to be Black in a way that their parents and their grandparents and generations before them were not. And so culture, when you think about it, music, people enjoy listening to music. It's fun. It's an activity that, people do so willingly, right? Well, when you have something like that operating at a cultural level and somebody's, on their headphones, on their computer, in their car, in their house, and like they choose, I want to listen to this. I want to watch this video. I want to check out this TV show. Like, wow, I like the way that looks. I want to wear these clothes. Those things are operating at a sort of subtle everyday level, but over time they have an impact. And so I think what we've seen are people who have some familiarity with Black culture. And it's not as though, just because you listen to rap music that you're somehow enlightened, but it's a start. And it's a connection that, if you pursue it, leads you into other forms of knowledge. And I think the connection between those examples and people being in the street is something that we can see based on this exposure to Black culture that has become so prominent in American society.
All right, 2 more clips to go. Let's go to a clip from my conversation with Toby Kent, who was the first Chief Resilience Officer in Australia for the city of Melbourne, talking about what constitutes resilience.
Many people in society don't want hippy-dippy bullshit. Mm-hmm. But in other ways, and the way we developed the Resilient Melbourne strategy was very informed by the work I did with retail and consumer goods companies kind of between about 2007, 2010, and work with them around climate change. And what was really clear was, in a sense, the climate change movement had, in part, putting aside the realities of lobbying and so forth that we touched on a little while ago, kind of slightly lost their way or lost the argument because they thought it was because it became about, you don't understand the science, let me tell you louder how you're wrong. And what they didn't lay out clearly enough was a more desirable future. And so within the resilience is where I note that on the podcast one of the books you highlight is Nicholas Taleb's Anti-Fragile, and so I'm also a fan of the book. And he has a phrase. He talks about resilience as a sissy word, and that it's weak, and hence it's about getting back to a status quo, whereas anti-fragile is thriving from it. And the things I loved about and continuing to work in the resilience field is, if you go back to the beginning of our conversation and that definition of resilience, the ability to adapt, to survive, and to thrive in the face of whatever chronic stresses and acute shocks you face, that thriving element was such an important part of our work. And so not just telling people that if we didn't do these things, bad things were going to happen to them. Essentially what we said is, wouldn't it be great to be able to get out, to have more parks, to get around the city more easily? Yeah, I know you don't want to have a community barbecue every time, but maybe life would be nicer if you said hi to your neighbors from time to time. Sometimes some quite small things that can sound, yes, hippy-dippy, but when you aggregate that, can have a really profound impact. And I think the other thing that comes from that and from the climate change piece is one of the reasons where why we haven't seen more action and why, in a sense, general interest at the broad populist level has not driven more political leadership and decision making. Is for many people it just felt too hard. You know, you're telling me that these burning fossil fuels are melting the ice caps and whatever, and I still want to take my holiday, so I understand that it's a problem. Yeah, I'm going to get on a flight, and how do I probably square it by just hiding from it? So actually, campaigns that we had around being neighborly and not being embarrassed to knock on a neighbor's door when it's an extreme heat day, and just make sure, particularly if they're elderly or otherwise vulnerable, have they got water, have they got access to air conditioning? You know, inviting someone into your house for 20 minutes can save their life. And of course, at a catastrophic level, we saw in France and in Athens, you know, where people didn't check on their neighbors, literally thousands of deaths during heat waves.
Right.
So again, hippy-dippy, yeah, I'm willing to wear the charge. But the flip side of it is tangible, achievable, and actionable by almost everyone each and every day.
All right, we're down to our last clip. It's from my conversation with New York Times best-selling author John Perkins of economic hitman fame. Here he is talking about how to change our perceptions, the theme of his latest book, Touching the Jaguar.
I think it's a very strong message, and the fact that it comes out of animals, yes, that the natural world is speaking to us, whether you want to look at our interest in plants like ayahuasca or our growing interest in organic foods, in vegetarianism, even veganism. There's a whole thing that's rising. I think there's a new consciousness on the planet. Human beings, we're feeling this consciousness. And the coronavirus is pushing us one step further toward realizing we have to change. That's the jaguar we have to touch. We have to get out of this economy and transform it into a life economy. And every one of us has a role to play in that. And this virus is giving us the time to think about that and to have these conversations and to look at what we do next.
How would you also position the touching the jaguar analogy to what's happening in the U.S. with the riots that, this week, there are riots that are happening in the U.S. and protests that are happening all over the world because of the police brutality in the U.S. And this is not something that's exclusive to the U.S. Police brutality and racism exists around the world. But how would you position the touching the jaguar analogy in relation to that?
Yes, and it has a big bearing, being in the United States, a country that in its sacred papers says all people are created equal, and ourselves on that over the centuries, and it's been a lie. And I grew up in the 60s. I was in college in the 60s. I joined the Peace Corps in the 60s. And back then, we all knew it was terrible discrimination. And there were these race riots then, and Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers all came forward. And then it's like we forgot about it. We didn't exactly forget, but it went on the back burner. And it's coming up again, and it needs to come up. I mean, it's terribly, terribly important that we understand that I am a privileged white male. There's no question. I didn't do anything to make that happen to me. I was born that way, but I certainly experienced lots of privileges as a white male American. And it's really important to understand that. And it's really important to understand the other side of the picture, that those people who don't experience that, they are in deep trouble, and there's tremendous resentment and anger. And so, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it happens at this time of the coronavirus, because this virus has pointed out to us that it's the people of color, it's the minority groups in this country that have suffered the most because of the virus, and the economic problems that have occurred. So these two things really go hand in hand, and they're both these very strong messages that we have to change. We have to change what it means to be human on this planet. We have to become more more socially responsible and more environmentally responsible, and we have to live lives that reflect that as citizens of this planet.
Yeah, that's very beautifully put. I want to get into this practice that's in your book, and maybe if you could just give us a little bit of an overview around this practice about how to make change happen. Where did it come from? And maybe if you could give us a little overview of what it is, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I can quickly summarize it, and it's in 5 questions, and I'll give a personal example to illustrate. So the first question we ask ourselves is, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest joy, the greatest satisfaction, the greatest bliss? For me, I love to write. I want to write. And the second question is, how do I tie this in with helping other people? Maybe it's one other person in your family, or maybe it's the whole world. But we know that people are happier when they also help other people and they support other people. So for me as a writer, I say, okay, so I'm going to write stories that inspire people to transform a death economy into a life economy. That's my idea. The question number 3 is, what's stopping you from doing this? What's the jaguar standing in your path? And I had a jaguar back, there's been many as a writer over the years, but the first one really was, I'd been a good writer in high school. I was editor of the newspaper, won a short story prize. And when I went to college, I had a teacher who was very well known as a writer, and I had a great admiration for him, and he criticized my work terribly, never gave me anything above a C. It hurt. I quit school because of that. And I eventually went back, but I didn't major in English. I majored in economics and business administration. I didn't want to have anything to do with writing. And so that was this jaguar that stood in my path, this voice from this authority figure who said, you're no good. And so the fourth question, how do we touch that jaguar? How do we change our perceptions to allow us to move forward with what we most want to do? And for me, it was suddenly I realized, well, this is just a guy. That's his opinion. And he's not an authority necessarily. He may be a published author. But then I remembered that he criticized Bob Dylan for his writing.
Right.
And Bob, yeah, and Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature, for goodness sake. So the jaguar was, well, this is just one voice. He doesn't not like your writing, but that doesn't matter. So you're a good writer, right? And so the fifth question is, what do I do? What action do I take every day? And for me as a writer, it's you write. And you can apply this to anything. A carpenter can say, I love to work. The question number 1, what do I most want to do with my life? I want to do carpentry work. I love doing it. How do I relate that to a bigger issue? I use sustainable materials whenever possible. What's the barrier standing in the way? My customers are going to say, sustainable materials may cost me more. I don't want to spend the extra money. And what's the jaguar touch? The jaguar tells you, change that perception. It's not a cost. When you buy sustainable, when you use sustainable products, you're investing in the future for yourself and your children and your grandchildren. And then what's the action you take every day? You go out and you tell customers you're going to do this, and you go to work doing it. And so, this process, and then it boils down to a thing we can do for 10 minutes every day. So each person can answer those questions in one sentence, each of those questions, answer that. And they're going to change. As you move forward, you confront one barrier, you overcome it, and then you'll find more barriers. I'm sure as a podcast host, Ben, you've run into plenty of barriers.
All the time. Yeah. All the time.
Yeah. If we take 5 minutes every day or every 2 days or once a week or whatever and really go into this process, it can change our lives. And it's the whole idea of transforming fear, the fear that we can't do it, into action to change your life and the world is the subtitle of the book, Touching the Jaguar. That's the subtitle, and that's what it's all about.
All right, I hope you all enjoyed that. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for your support. And we look forward to many more conversations over the course of 2021 and beyond. A Happy New Year. I hope you are well. I wish you all the best. We will be back soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.